China just hijacked Canada's economy and signed deals that were supposed to be America's, $320 billion worth. While Trump raised tariffs, Beijing rewired the global energy map. Canada didn't flinch. They flipped sides. Now oil flows east to Shanghai instead of south to Texas. U.S. farmers are bankrupt. Apple's losing China faster than it can redesign an iPhone. This wasn't diplomacy. It was economic desertion. Not a trade war, but a strategic eviction in the U.S. economy. It might be the last to realize it's getting locked out. The worst part, Washington fired the first shot and never saw the counterstrike coming. On May 16, 2025, Reuters confirmed that China is now the top buyer of Canadian crude flowing through the newly operational Trans Mountain Pipeline. Until last year was earmarked for U.S. West Coast refiners. This pivot wasn't gradual. It followed a decisive move by the Trump administration to impose a 10% tariff on Canadian oil, part of a broader attempt to corner allies into tougher China-facing trade positions. Instead of folding, Canada rerouted its strategy eastward across the Pacific. Beijing responded by ramping up purchases of Canadian LNG, signing multi-year supply deals, and bypassing U.S. energy markets entirely. This is no longer about sanctions, said Kevin Byrne, VP of S&P Global. This is about long-term control over who sells to whom and who no longer does. The $34 billion Trans Mountain expansion was originally built to diversify Canadian exports. But in just 12 months, it's become a geopolitical shortcut for China, turning America's backyard into Beijing's new gas station. And what happens when Washington's trade weapons redirect its own allies into the arms of its biggest rival? That question has only just begun to unfold. According to Bloomberg, Energy Intelligence, Chinese crude imports from Canada surged 870% in the first 4 months of 2025, coinciding with a sharp drop in Chinese imports of U.S. oil, now down 68% year over year. That gap wasn't random. It was filled with Canadian barrels, rerouted through Trans Mountain's 890,000 barrel per day capacity. The pipeline's activation coincided with China's broader strategy to reduce dependence on Russian and Venezuelan oil, both constrained by sanctions, and the payoff massive. S&P estimates the combined LNG and crude trade between China and Canada could exceed $320 billion by 2030, anchored by projects like British Columbia's LNG terminal set to export 14 million tons annually starting in late 2025. It's a realignment we haven't seen since the post-OPEC shock of the 1970s, noted Amy Myers-Jaffe of NYU's Center on Global Energy Policy. While the U.S. sought to isolate China with energy pressure, Beijing outflanked that move by securing America's traditional suppliers. But this isn't just about who buys oil. It's about who builds trust while the world redraws the supply map. And right now, China's ink is drying faster than Washington's warnings. In April 2025, Chinese Ambassador Wang Di issued a rare direct statement from Ottawa, calling the U.S. a bully and urging Canada to stand on the right side of history. The message published by the Canadian press wasn't subtle. Wang proposed a coordinated effort with Canada to rally nations against what he described as unilateral economic coercion by Washington. While the rhetoric is provocative, it reflects a broader reality. China is positioning itself as a rules-based alternative to U.S. pressure tactics, especially in trade. Beijing sees Canada as a weak link in the U.S. alliance chain, said Roland Paris of the University of Ottawa. That weak link now includes growing volumes of crude and LNG exports, direct diplomatic outreach to provincial premiers, and a diplomatic PR campaign to reframe Beijing as a stabilizer rather than disruptor. But Canada hasn't fully embraced the narrative. Mark Carney, Canada's new Prime Minister, recently called China the biggest security threat to Canada and reaffirmed Ottawa's 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. Still, Wang's offer reflects a broader trend. China is rewriting alliances not through ideology, but through infrastructure and invoice. And if trade partners are starting to listen, who's actually isolating whom U.S. exports to China dropped 23% in the first quarter of 2025, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, marking the 6th consecutive quarterly decline. While public focus remains on tariffs behind the scenes, American multinationals are bleeding access to the very markets they helped globalize. Qualcomm, which once generated 47% of its global revenue from China, has lost 2 major contracts in 2025 alone. Bloomberg reported after local Chinese firms were incentivized to switch to domestic chip alternatives. Apple, which sells 16% of its products in China, has seen its market share drop below 10% for the first time in 5 years, according to Canalys. General Motors sales in China are down 28% since 2022, with Chinese EV startups like BYD now outpacing U.S. automakers in urban adoption rates. This isn't a cycle, said Sean Rain, managing director of China Market Research Group. It's a rotation away from American brands permanently. While some U.S. companies banked on long-term loyalty from Chinese consumers' policy and perception have shifted. China's trade retaliation hasn't been loud. It's been clinical incentivized imports from elsewhere shrink U.S. market share and leave the doors unlocked, but less welcoming. The question isn't whether the door is closed. It's whether U.S. firms noticed it was already halfway shut. In 2024, U.S. soybean exports to China collapsed from 40% to 18% of China's total imports, while Brazil and Argentina now supply 74%, according to USDA data. That collapse triggered an economic cascade. Soybean prices fell 17% year over year. Wheat prices dropped 9%. And pork producers saw export volumes plunge amid 35% surges in European shipments to China, according to Bloomberg Agriculture. In response, the U.S. government dispersed $122 billion in farm aid, with $7.7 billion going to soybean growers alone based on USDA reports. But even that has failed to stem bankruptcies. According to the American Farm Bureau, farm loan defaults hit a 10-year high in the first quarter of 2025, especially in Iowa and Illinois. This is no longer just a trade dispute. It's a liquidity crisis on the farm, said Joe Glauber, former USDA chief economist. The real gut punch farmers built, entire logistics chains, transport, processing, storage around China as a buyer. With that buyer gone, the infrastructure doesn't just sit idle. It drags the entire agri-economy down with it. But the broader concern? Once a buyer like China switches suppliers, they rarely come back. Washington built the fuse. Beijing lit it, but no one expected the fire to spread this fast. In 2018, the White House believed tariffs would drive manufacturing home and isolate China. 7 years later, the results are inverted. According to the Peterson Institute, U.S. imports from China dropped 22% in 2024. But imports from countries like Vietnam and Mexico surged 40%, often routing Chinese-made goods through indirect partners. Meanwhile, U.S. companies report rising costs. Bloomberg found that 88% of American firms operating in China reported decreased profitability in 2025, driven by retaliatory tariffs, regulatory slowdowns, and customer attrition. And in a surreal twist, companies like Walmart, long symbols of American scale, are caught negotiating with Beijing after pressuring Chinese suppliers to offset tariff hikes, triggering direct diplomatic pushback. The original vision was pressure for compliance. What's unfolded instead is a fragmented supply network, rising inflation risks, and a power vacuum that's being filled just not by Washington. The story was supposed to be about leverage. Now it's about fallout. In May 2025, the U.S. Energy Information Administration reported a 27% year-over-year drop in U.S. crude exports to China, while Chinese imports of Canadian oil hit an all-time high. The shift wasn't ideological, it was infrastructural. The $34 billion Trans Mountain expansion now gives Canada direct ocean access to Asia, bypassing the U.S. Gulf entirely. And it's not just crude. Canada's LNG terminal in British Columbia, set to launch later this year, already has locked contracts with China for 14 million metric tons annually per S&P Global Commodity Insights. Washington's 10% tariff on Canadian oil meant to pressure trade alignment backfired. This has effectively redirected Canadian energy policy toward Asia, said Andrew Leach, energy economist at the University of Alberta. More quietly, China has offered to co-invest in Canadian export infrastructure, tightening energy ties and reducing Beijing's exposure to U.S.-controlled sea lanes. If the U.S. once viewed pipelines as veins of strategic influence, it now faces a reality where those veins bypass its markets and feed its competitors. The numbers are no longer abstract. Between January and April 2025, Chinese imports from the U.S. fell 26.8%, while imports from ASEAN countries jumped 21%, and from Canada up 44%, according to customs data published by China's Ministry of Commerce. That's not just retaliation, it's substitution. In tech, U.S. chip makers like AMD and NVIDIA lost an estimated $4.3 billion in potential contracts in China due to restrictions and rising domestic competition, Bloomberg reported. In agriculture, U.S. corn exports declined 34%, while imports from Ukraine increased 19%. China's retaliatory measures are structured for permanence, said Eswar Prasad, senior fellow at Brookings. The shift isn't framed as conflict, it's framed as resilience. By building supply redundancy and bolstering domestic alternatives, Beijing is creating insulation against Western pressure. And when retaliation looks like diversification, the game becomes less about confrontation and more about exclusion. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, U.S. GDP growth slowed to 0.3% in Q1 2025, down from 2.8% in Q3 2024 as exports weakened and business investment contracted. Trade contributed a 0.7 percentage points to GDP in Q1, a sharp reversal from positive trade balances in 2022 and 2023. Simultaneously, core inflation climbed to 3.5%, squeezing the Federal Reserve between raising rates and risking recession. But the more strategic signal isn't domestic, it's relational. Canada's $320 billion energy tilt toward China isn't just a trade reroute, it's a political message. Europe's quiet drift toward Beijing in sectors like EVs and critical minerals points to a broader dislocation. The U.S. hasn't lost its position because of its economy, said Matthew Goodman of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It's losing it because of how it's managing its partners. Trade wars may be designed to isolate rivals, but when they begin to isolate allies, the question becomes less about recovery and more about recalibration. Canada's $320 billion wasn't just energy lost, it was trust transferred. But if you think this ends with pipelines and pork, you're not seeing the bigger play. Because while Washington tries to stop China's oil imports, it's missing the other flow capital alliances and influence shifting east. The next trade move won't be about products, it'll be about currency contracts and control over the platforms that run them. And if you thought losing Canada was shocking, just wait until you see which country Beijing's targeting next. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.